On Easter Sunday, hundreds of millions of Christians around the world echoed the words of their ancestors throughout the centuries. In every church, in every corner of the earth, the minister says, "Christ is risen." And the response from the congregation, "He is risen indeed. Alleluia." So as we remember the resurrection of Christ at Easter, so we think about the idea of being raised from death to life. And it is through this lens that we look upon today's country house. Auckland Castle served as the seat of the Bishops of Durham, with one brief interlude during the Commonwealth in the 1650s, for more than 8 centuries. By 2012, the castle was in such a state of decline that the church commissioners put it up for sale. It was widely thought that there was no hope for this ancient country house and its collection. That is, until an English philanthropist with an extraordinary vision bought the castle and placed it into a trust. Over the past decade, Auckland Castle has undergone what can only be described as a resurrection, from a forgotten and decaying pile to a cutting-edge attraction that has brought employment, tourism and life to the town of Bishop Auckland and to much of County Durham.
Welcome back to the Country House podcast. I'm Rory Fraser.
And I'm Jeff Heath Taylor.
And we are very excited to be doing this episode on Auckland Castle, which is, and brace yourself, listeners, the resurrection of a country house. And we're doing this, of course, because we are beginning to celebrate Easter, which, as our more religious listeners will know, is all about the resurrection. So Auckland is one of those sort of happy names in the English country house tradition in England at the moment, isn't it, Jeff? Because it's sort of it's got a happy story. It's got an interesting story.
It does. It's not just a happy story in terms of country houses, but in terms of from a Christian perspective, the decline of the Church of England in Britain, and so many church buildings and bishops' palaces being sold off, some becoming private homes, some becoming hotels, some falling into more decay. And it's wonderful that Auckland Castle tells a different story.
Yes, absolutely. I hadn't thought of that parallel. That's very
and actually, it links well, Rory. It links in well with the episode we did a few weeks ago on the decline of St Giles House, and we were hoping to do a part 2 on the revival of St Giles, but we haven't been able to get our guest on quite yet. So this ties in quite nicely with the idea of a country house that was also in decline, but which sort of came back to life.
Yes, we'll have to choose our words carefully. So we've done resurrection, and we can do rebirth or revival next time. We can't use the same ones. Anyway,
yes, you're right.
But let's get started. So, can you tell me? Auckland was I believe, the seat of the Bishop of Durham. So can you tell me a little bit about who the Bishop of Durham was, what role he played, why he needed a palace or a castle, indeed, all that kind of thing?
So Auckland Castle was one of the seats of the Bishops of Durham. It became their principal seat in the 19th century when Durham Castle became, I think, part of the University of Durham. Okay. That's now Castle College. So Durham Castle was originally the principal seat, and Auckland Castle was, I suppose, their country seat, their hunting seat. It's also in County Durham. It's just on the edge of Bishop Auckland, a historic town in County Durham. It's one of those wonderful houses that sits right in the town centre on the one side, but then has an enormous park on the other side. So a bit like sort of Petworth or, Hovingen, one of these houses that is right in the town on one side, and then big space on the other. Ainhoe's another one. So it's a lovely building.
Isn't it?
Yeah, it's a lovely building, and it is. So it was the seat of the Bishops of Durham. It was their principal seat from the early 19th century through to 2012, when the house was sold. The castle was sold, as I mentioned in the opening quote, and it was a particularly significant building because of the significance of the inhabitant, who was, as you mentioned, Rory, the Bishop of Durham. So the Bishop of Durham was historically one of the most powerful figures, not only in the Church of England, but in England generally, including politically. Of course, this was thinking back to the medieval times, pre-Reformation, and essentially the early sort of Christianization of what was then Northumbria. It meant that a church was established, a bishopric was established in Durham in the late 10th century. So this is before the Norman Conquest. And St Cuthbert settled in County Durham. And over the centuries, the Bishops of Durham held extraordinary authority, both as head of the Diocese of Durham, where their cathedral was, of course, the extraordinary, beautiful Durham Cathedral, but they also wielded unusual secular powers, quite unique within the British English Church, and that's
Were
because
they Prince Bishops?
well, exactly. So from the Norman conquest right up until the 19th century, they were known as the Prince Bishop of Durham, and they ruled a county palatine. So it's strange, but Durham was known as the County Palatine of Durham. I know. So it's extraordinary.
I think that. Do we still have Prince Bishops?
Well, technically, the Bishop of Durham is still a Prince Bishop, but he's lost all his princely powers, so he's really just the Bishop of Durham now.
I just love it. I think it's so good. I think I'd make a wonderful Prince Bishop. That's definitely my thing. I wonder
if they keep their princely titles after they move on.
Oh, that'd be so good. I think they should definitely bring back hunting lodges for all British bishops. Can you imagine a sort of incredibly liberal British bishop today?
Oh well, I'm not a huge fan of liberal bishops, Rory. So
I'd rather red rag to a bull.
Yes, it is. I would rather the liberal bishops don't sit in the Lords as well. But there we go. Rory? Do you know much about the idea of county palatines? Because there are a few palatinates, weren't there?
No, I don't.
You're not sure about them. So I'm not entirely sure of what qualified a county to be a palatinate county, but essentially that means a princely county. And Durham was known as the County Palatine of Durham, and it had essentially near sovereign authority. So it was almost like we've talked in the past about how often estates or counties with great, the Devonshires, for example, in Derbyshire are sort of the kings and queens of Derbyshire in a way at Chatsworth.
It's normally the border counties. So if you're looking at counties that are so far away from London, that it's quite hard to communicate with them easily. And so you've got your sort of march lords and things.
Well, that's interesting. And that makes sense because also they needed to be able to respond to threats. And so what was interesting with the Prince Bishop of Durham is he had these extraordinary sort of allowances. So he was known as the Prince Bishop. He could raise an army without approval from the king. So again, that's quite helpful if he realizes that the North's been invaded by the Scots and it's going to take too long for the message to get down to London. It makes sense that the Prince Bishop can raise his own army. He could mint coins. He could mint his own coins, have his own currency. He could levy taxes. He could hold courts. He had the ability to pardon any criminals of any offence.
It really is sovereign. I mean, that's extraordinary.
Well, it's exactly that. It's because of its proximity to the Scottish border that it needed sort of a strong leader, essentially. And what was interesting is that it wasn't a landowner. It wasn't the Duke of Northumberland, for example, who was appointed with these powers. It was the bishop. And I wonder if that's because, therefore, it wasn't kingly because it wasn't hereditary. Bishops we know are appointed; they don't inherit their bishopric. And so, in some ways, it was a sort of it was almost like a sort of, I suppose, the king was able to retain his sort of divine right, but he was able to appoint the bishops who would then support him. It's interesting.
So he's got his sort of townhouse, Durham Castle, and he's got his weekend retreat, Auckland Castle, and where presumably he goes to hunt and sort of probably spend time with mistresses that he pretended he didn't have and that sort of thing. We chortle in a manly way.
Yeah, exactly.
But what did he? I mean, what does it look like? How palatial was it for this Prince Bishop?
Yeah. So it like all sort of early medieval buildings, it did evolve over time. So the sort of core is from the 12th century, so about 1183 is when they started, when the bishops of Durham started using it, and it's very old, and it's interesting because it's on this very strategic site. It's on a piece of flat ground between the River Gornless and the River Wear, and like I said, the town of Bishop Auckland sort of abuts the castle to the west, and on the other three sides, it sort of the land falls away down to these rivers. So it's in quite a very strategic place because it's got these enormous gates into the town on the one side, and then these sort of cliffs on the other side falling down to the river. So
it sounds very like Durham Castle, actually, which is also right on the edge of this sort of big cliff in the middle of Durham city. Is Durham a city or a town? I'm not sure.
No, Durham's a city. It is a city. It's one of the smaller cities, a bit bigger than Wales. And actually, interestingly, the Bishop of Durham ranks 4th in the order of precedence amongst bishops after the Archbishop of Canterbury, York, and London. So it's the fourth most important bishopric after those
Interesting.
three.
Okay.
So the castle was begun by a chap called Hugh de Puiset, or Preset, back in the early 12th century, when
Good
they
English
still
name.
had very, very French names. Exactly. Yes. So Hugh de Puiset was this very Norman sounding bishop in the 12th century. And again, for our listeners who aren't familiar, I'm sure you may well have heard of the Battle of Hastings. That was when the Normans defeated Harold, King Harold, the arrow in the eye, and all the sort of British history subsequently is sort of what's taught in schools. So for Rory and I, when we were at prep school, we would have been taught from 1066 onwards, basically, chronologically. That's how they do it in England.
Well, the phrases,
Plus the
my
Romans.
family, as the listeners will know, are Scottish, but the phrases were originally known as to frizzle, and they came in with the Normans. So,
so you're not a Celt. You're not a Celt, Rory.
I'm afraid I'm not. No, it's terrible. I'm not a Celt. Are you of good Saxon stock, Jeff?
Norman on my father's side, but my mother is a proper working class Scot, and she's 100% Celtic. Fotheringham was her maiden name, so I'm probably more Scottish than you, Rory.
You probably actually are more Scottish. Classic. Okay, well let's move on quickly. This is very embarrassing for me.
So Hugh de Puiset, he starts this modest hunting lodge, and over time it expands. A chapel is built by Bishop Beck in the 14th century. He adds defensive structures, and the biggest changes actually happened in the 17th and 18th centuries, but we will get to that in a bit because we sort of want to go through chronologically. So really it sort of then stayed as this sort of hunting lodge right up until the Reformation. And actually that sort of coincided, or just after the Reformation, we had in 1603, we had the Union of the Crowns. And at this point, Scotland fell under, as for our listeners who aren't familiar, Scotland fell under the English crown. The Union of the Crowns was when there was one king who was King of Scotland and England, and that was James the First and Sixth. And so at that point, Auckland began to 1603. So at that point, Auckland began to slightly lose its significance as a military stronghold.
Yeah,
because we weren't expecting invasions from the Scots all the time, and this was a key thing because at this point, there was a bishop called Tobias Matthew who invited up Queen Anne of Denmark, who was married to James the First and Sixth, Prince Henry, who was their eldest son, and Princess Elizabeth, who was had the wonderful title of Electress of the Palatinate and Queen of Bohemia, when she was married to Frederick V of the Palatinate.
She sounds fun.
Oh, the Winter Queen. Well, we need to talk about her because Ashdown House in Berkshire was built for the Winter Queen. And it's a phenomenal house.
Sometimes when I get out of bed on the wrong side, and when I sometimes get out of bed on the wrong side in the morning, I think I should probably be called the Winter Queen, Jeff, because I get very grumpy. Anyway,
so they stayed there they stayed at Auckland Castle on their way up from Scotland, so their way down from Scotland to London at the after the Union of the Crowns. So it was a key stopping point, and very symbolic of sort of this union. And then we'd had the Reformation that had swung over to it had become a Protestant bishopric, obviously, and the Tobias Matthew was a Protestant bishop, an Anglican bishop. Yeah. And then what we saw the disestablishment of the Church of England after the First Civil War. And so at this point in 1646, when the Church of England stopped, when Oliver Cromwell was Lord Protector, we saw Auckland Castle being sold to a chap called Arthur Hazelrig. And he was a baronet, he was a politician, and he was a big critic of Charles I. He was a very important Roundhead during the Civil War. And he bought Auckland Castle and demolished much of the medieval building and built this extraordinary mansion house. And then only a few years later, we had the restoration of the monarchy, and we had a new Bishop of Durham, John Cosson, who then demolished Hazelrig's mansion and rebuilt the castle. So it was sort of this funny thing where the castle that we see looks like a medieval castle. It's actually a pastiche. It's a neo-medieval castle built in the 17th century, mostly. But there
So
was a little bit
that's
left
interesting.
over, which was the banqueting hall that still stood from the 13th century. And at this point, that was converted into the chapel, and that still stands. And it's one of the most extraordinary rooms in the north of England.
Okay, so basically, the person who this chap who bought it decided it wasn't as grand enough for him, and it wasn't as sort of it wasn't what he imagined a Prince Bishop's palace should look like. So he actually makes it much more glamorous than it really was.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, interesting.
But then we have quite a fun story about what happens next, because what we get next is actually fast forward a little bit. So we're going now through to the 18th century. So this is when some big changes occur, particularly under this fascinating bishop. So Bishop Cossin, I mentioned, rebuilt the house in the 17th century as a medieval castle. And then what's interesting is in the 1750s, so mid 18th century, there was a bishop called Richard Trevor, who I think is quite an interesting guy, and I'm going to tell you about him, Rory.
I just want to stop you first because I'm a bit confused. So it hasn't left the clergy yet.
No,
it's
so it
just
was bought
been
back, but essentially it was sold to Arthur Hazelrig. He knocked down the castle, built a country house. Then after the restoration, it was seized off Arthur Hazelrig and given back to the church. And at that point, the next bishop, Cossin, then rebuilt the medieval castle. Yeah.
So good old Charles II thought that his Prince Bishop couldn't possibly be without a hunting lodge, basically. So
exactly.
They got it back.
I think Arthur Hazelrig was not popular because he was so he had been so critical of Charles I, and
I mean, to be honest, it's quite easy to be critical of Charles I. He wasn't a very good king. Well, he had a great taste in art.
Well, interesting. That's what I wanted to talk about.
Digress.
So then we have this fascinating bishop who also had a great taste in art, Bishop Richard Trevor, and I find this guy really interesting because he very bright man, was canon of Christ Church, Oxford, and ended up becoming Bishop of St. David's, and then was consecrated Bishop of Durham in 1752. And what I love about this is he was known as St. Durham by Horace Walpole. And now Horace Walpole, who we know was a great collector and patron of the arts, he was good friends with Bishop Trevor, Richard Trevor, because of their patronage of the arts together. But also he was called St. Durham because Richard Trevor was supposedly had a big reputation for his saintliness. He was very godly man, so godly, in fact, that when he died, he bequeathed £3,500, which was a significant amount of money in those days, to charity and to the poor. And he also believed in maintaining very high standards amongst the clerics he appointed. So he basically would appoint vicars and then make sure they weren't lazy and whatever. He was quite a tough leader, but very godly in that sense as well. And he did a lot of work at Auckland Castle. So I don't know if I assume it was his own wealth that he brought to the table. And he had a wonderful house in Sussex called Glynde Place, which still belongs to his sort of descendants, because he was Glynde Place ended up going to his elder brother, Robert Hampton Trevor, who was the first Viscount Hampton, and that house has remained in the Hampton family. But what I like about what Bishop Trevor did, and this is really important, is he added significantly to the castle. He updated it in the latest fashions of the 18th century. He actually put in, interestingly, because the bishops of Durham are the prince bishops, unusually they have their own throne room. So in Auckland Castle, there is a throne room on which the prince bishop would sit on his throne, which I think is fantastic.
That is so exciting.
And this was sort of updated in the sort of slightly sort of Strawberry Hill Gothic style, perhaps influenced by Horace Walpole. And he did lots of other things, but the most famous thing that Richard Trevor did was he bought a incredibly notable set of paintings. And this was a set of 13 paintings. Well, actually, it was 12 paintings. The title is Jacob and His 12 Sons by Francisco de Zurbaran. And there should obviously be 13 because there's Jacob plus his 12 sons. But unfortunately, the 13th painting, which was of Benjamin, the youngest of the 12 sons, ended up being sold separately to the Duke of Ancaster, who lived at Grimsthorpe Castle. which I know Rory's a
Indeed, he
fan
did,
of.
yeah.
'Cause it's
Big
got
fan.
a Vanbrugh facade, and that painting still hangs at Grimsthorpe. So sadly, in the 1750s, the 13th painting was separated from the first 12, and it's been separated ever since. But those 12, Jacob and his first 11 sons, still hang in the dining room, the long dining room at Auckland Castle. And they're extraordinary paintings. I mean, for our listeners who aren't familiar, I'm sure you're familiar with the story of Joseph and his Technicolor Dreamcoat. Joseph, of course, being one of the 12 sons of Jacob, and they ganged up against him. And of course, Jacob was the father of the people of Israel, and the 12 tribes are the 12 sons. It's a very important part of Judeo-Christian history. And these are very symbolic men. And they hang in this long dining room. And that'll sort of take us through to where we are a bit later. But I just wanted to go back to the architecture, Rory, because this is really important. After Bishop Trevor, we had a guy called a fantastic name, Shute Barrington. His first name was Shute, but S-H-U-T-E. And he employed James Wyatt. So it was at this point, I think, actually, just after Richard Trevor, when the throne room was sort of slightly Gothicized. James Wyatt. Rory, do you want to give it a context to James Wyatt?
I absolutely can. I love Mr. Wyatt. So Wyatt, everybody, was a one of the architects from the late 18th, early 19th century, who was able to design. He was sort of architecturally ambidextrous. I think he could design in the classical in a very beautiful way, and he could design in the Gothic in a very, very beautiful way. And he was incredibly talented. And he, for example, designed the Folly Broadway Tower for the Earl of Coventry that we've probably spoken about before. And that was one of his smaller commissions, but it's a very famous one, which is very, very late 18th century Gothic. And he, I think he was one of the people who helped to kind of validate Horace Walpole's vision before people like Pugin started to, do kind of major neo-Gothic things. But he had an incredible eye, and his interpretation of the Gothic is really whimsical, but also solid and elegant and rather moving, I think.
Yeah, he was. I suppose he was of the time of Robert Adam, wasn't he? I suppose he was a rival to Robert Adam in that he was also a neoclassical architect partly, but then, like you mentioned, Rory, he also dabbled in the neo-Gothic, and so he sort of was a bit more of a jack of all trades. And one of his most famous buildings, which doesn't exist anymore, is the Pantheon, which was built on Oxford Street. Fascinating building. Again, Horace Walpole pronounced it to be the most beautiful edifice in England. It was this fantastic sort of entertainment space on Oxford Street. But
I've never heard of it.
Wyatt, oh yeah, it's a fascinating building. I don't know when it was demolished actually, but it was demolished in 1937. It was actually there for a while. It became Winter Assembly Rooms, but had this fantastic rotunda. But yeah, so Wyatt comes in and sort of updates the house, makes it very comfortable, makes it much more like a country house, not just a seat for a bishop. And it was Shute Barrington who basically tried to he employed James Wyatt to try and sort of link up the sort of medieval style with the contemporary, the sort of more Georgian style that Trevor had brought in, which is why Shute brought in James Wyatt, because the sort of neo-Gothic tied in the sort of medieval Gothic with the Regency or the Georgian, which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
And then the last Prince Bishop was a guy called William Van Mildert. Now, for anyone who went to Durham University, a lot of these names are now names of colleges at Durham. Van Mildert is a college at Durham. Castle College, obviously, is in the old Bishop's Castle, and St. Cuthbert we mentioned as well. So it's very interesting. A lot of links. William Van Mildert was the last Prince Bishop of Durham. And he was the one who gave over the castle as his principal seat to found Durham University. So William Van Mildert founded Durham University.
So what are we talking, like late 19th century?
This is late 19th. Late 18th, early 19th century. So he was Bishop of Durham from 18. Oh yeah, he he was in the ministry from the late 18th century, but he was Bishop of
Mm-hmm.
Durham in the 1820s, and it was around that time that he gave over Durham Castle to found Durham University. And at this point, Auckland became even more important because it became the sole episcopal seat for the See of Durham. And that kind of brings us through a little bit to the present day, but I'm sure you have some other queries for me, Rory, which before we get to sort of the resurrection, so to speak.
Well, I certainly do. I have lots of queries. I mean, I'm very interested. I mean, I've been to Durham lots, and it's kind of, I didn't really know any of this history, so it's I mean, you know, Durham is really one of the, before we move on, it's one of the loveliest cities in England, isn't it? I mean, it's famous for its university, which is one of the best universities in the UK. It's got all these colleges in this little sort of, you know, you've got this big bend in the river, which kind of, with this hill coming out of it, which is sort of kind of scattered with colleges, and then right at the top, sort of almost blooming out of it, is this enormous Norman cathedral and the castle. It's incredibly dramatic, and you know, academically, it's a great powerhouse. What are your thoughts on Durham?
Yeah, I think it's wonderful. It's, as we mentioned before, it's quite a small city. So for our listeners who aren't familiar, there are only 3 universities in Britain which are collegiate universities, or in England at least. Don't know if St Andrews is sort of semi-collegiate, isn't it? But not really. I suppose it's kind of really. Anyways, Oxford and Cambridge obviously are famously collegiate. That is that when you apply to the university, you apply to a college, and that becomes your sort of family for your degree. And Durham is the only other university other than Oxford and Cambridge that has this system of colleges, and that's why it's got a similar vibe, I suppose, to Oxford and Cambridge in terms of being very much primarily a university town. The university buildings are scattered everywhere, and this wonderful cathedral. It's more historic as a city, of course, than even Oxford or Cambridge because of this ancient cathedral. And my favourite, of course, Rory, is we need to do an episode one day on Brasenose University in Stamford. You know the story.
Yes.
A group of rebels from Oxford who tried to start a new university.
If you and I had been monks in Oxbridge, Jeff, we would definitely have been kicked out and had to go and start a college in the middle of nowhere. I think that would have been very us.
No doubt. 100%.
Anyway, so let's just bring it back to Auckland. So can we talk? We've talked about the design. We've begun to talk about its implications on a sort of wider level. What was after it became the seat of the bishop? Sorry, what was it doing? I mean, what was its role really? What So, I mean, I don't actually know the answer to this. What do bishops do with their palaces?
Well, that's true. So it had a couple of key roles. One of it, like any sort of country house, or I should say, you know, royal palace, for example, was to it meant visually it stood for something to passers by and to the local community. So from the perspective of the role of the Prince Bishop of Durham, the castle itself was built to symbolize the dual spiritual and secular power held by the Prince Bishops. And so that's why it was part fortress and part palace. It was, on the one hand, very practical, on the other hand, very homely. And this was the idea that it was a bit like somewhere like Windsor Castle or something. Of course, which, you know, the king is the supreme governor of the Church of England and also holds this twin role of being political and spiritual leader. So the castle represented this double role for the Prince Bishops, who were essentially sort of quasi-monarchs in County Durham. And so they needed their residences to project not only their sort of dual role, but also their own sort of legitimacy, their sacred legitimacy as God's representative in the county of Durham. They wanted to also assert their control through the building, which is why it was put in such a strategic location with all its sort of reinforcements, the battlements, and all that sort of stuff. And this links in with the role that the house played for the Bishop of Durham at the height of the bishop's power. So So from the 13th to the 19th century, it was a really key symbol of episcopal rule, the power of bishops in England. And as I mentioned, these prince bishops had unique secular powers, the raising of the armies, the minting coins, the levying taxes, etc. And so the castle was both a seasonal residence, a hunting lodge, but it was also an administrative centre. It, as I mentioned, it was at the palace or Auckland Castle that royal guests would stay. They wouldn't stay in the town; they would stay at Auckland. So if they're passing up to Scotland or passing back, as James and Anne of Denmark were doing, they would stay at Auckland. And it really became a hub, not only of governance over the north of England, but also a social hub as a place to entertain, because it was a country house as well. It was a social hub for all the local landlords and aristocrats and gentry. And so everyone, the parties that were thrown by the bishops of Durham, to I suppose, soft power. We talked about this in our episode last week with Tim in terms of the role of country houses and having soft power. So the Bishop of Durham would host important figures across the county and across the region for grand dinners and banquets and parties, thus sort of endearing themselves to him, which enabled him to have more control politically and spiritually over the region. So it had a lot of soft power influences, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. That's very interesting. It's very, very interesting. It kind of, I'm reminded of all those sort of, I've never actually read Trollope, but it feels to me quite trollopy, the idea of the kind of the bishop in his palace softly encouraging people to do what he wants with the impressive architecture behind him. Any of our listeners who actually have read Trollope can probably correct me, because I don't know whether that's true or not. But
Rory, I really want to do a special podcast episode at some point on perhaps the softest of soft power country houses, and that was the floating country house that was the Royal Yacht Britannia. We should 100% do the Royal Yacht Britannia, because not only was it the Queen's floating country house, which she adored, but it was also the best way for Britain to get foreign leaders to sign over the right treaties and stuff, was to invite them for dinner with the Queen on the Royal Yacht Britannia, and they were putty in her hands. It was extraordinary.
I think we should do it dressed as sailors, Jeff. We should get little sailor hats.
Oh no, we should do that. You know what we should do? We should do the Villa of Frucy de Rothschild, which was a villa in the Cap Ferrat that was made to look like a ship. It was on this peninsula. Do you know about this, Rory? On this peninsula,
no,
so you can see water from three sides. And the Baroness Rothschild, at the time who built the villa, made all her gardeners dress as sailors with berets and pom-poms and stripy shirts, because she wanted to feel that she was on a ship. She would be in her long gallery, which was like the bridge of the ship, looking down at the gardens, which were like the decks, and her gardeners would be wearing sailors' uniforms. I mean, hilarious.
This is the top level history you expect on the Country House podcast, everyone. That is completely ridiculous. Not quite as ridiculous, I have to say, as that stupid little dog you kept. It wasn't even a dog. What was it? That monkey or something, when we were doing our Elton Palace episode.
Oh gosh, the monkey had its own bedroom with its own little heated bedroom with a ladder. And dreadful.
Couldn't believe it. It reminds me a little bit of what's that character called from All Creatures Great and Small? Tricky Woo, Mrs. Pumphrey's dog, Tricky Woo, famous. For any vets who are listeners, famous of literary character. Anyway, never mind. Back to the bishops of Durham. Can you? I mean, we've talked about soft power. Can we talk about economic power? I mean, presumably, all this building over such a long period of time and always entertaining and this royal focus, not to mention the bishops having all of this power themselves, there must have been a significant economic and political effect on the local area, right?
Well, yeah, it was. I mean, because he had the powers of the king, he could raise taxes if he wanted to. Bearing in mind this is post Magna Carta, when so many, most people weren't feudal lords anymore and couldn't just do what they wanted to the people who worked on the land. Unusually, the Prince Bishop of Durham could, so he could raise taxes. Yeah. But interestingly, generally speaking, they were quite benevolent, but they did encourage. They basically could keep whatever money the county earned, and so the primary employment was agriculture. maintenance and domestic service, because there were some very big country houses in County Durham, and this, including across Bishop Auckland, the bishop's household was seasonal, so he would come and go. Essentially, he'd be at Auckland Castle for some of the season, for some of the year, and then in Durham Castle for the rest. And this season, it was very much seasonal employment, which is interesting because it kind of brings us back to where we are today, where a lot of the employment is seasonal because of the tourism industry that's now booming in Auckland, Bishop Auckland.
Yeah.
But so we had a booming market town that was Bishop Auckland itself. So as a result of the Bishop's Palace, then we ended up getting a very successful town in the former Bishop Auckland. And then we also saw ecclesiastical patronage. So whilst he was bringing all this money and he could levy taxes as he wished and didn't have to pay into the king's coffers and was therefore very wealthy, he was just, generally speaking, the Prince Bishops of Durham were great patrons. And so they built dozens of schools, churches, hospitals all over the region, which again was very clever because on the one hand, it was seen as philanthropic, spiritual, godly, helping the poor. But what it was sort of secondarily doing was consolidating this image of the bishop as both a man there by divine right as God's representative, the spiritual role, and the political role, that he had the capital to do this. It's sort of he embedded his role in the sort of social fabric of County Durham, that so many people were reliant on him. Yes, they would be earning money and paying taxes to him, but at the same time, they were dependent on his philanthropy, his patronage for their schools and hospitals and so on. So it's quite interesting how it was sort of that soft and hard power again. Yeah.
Right. So they're doing all of that. They're exercising their power. And then, as you mentioned earlier, arguably the most significant aspects of Auckland, presumably, are those Zurbaran paintings, right?
Yeah. So Zurbaran was a Spanish Baroque. Zurbaran.
Okay.
And he was a Spanish Baroque painter in the 1640s. One of the great artists of his age. And as I mentioned, there were these 13 portraits, Jacob and his 12 sons, and they were the 12 tribes of Israel, and these were acquired in 1756. And it's because Richard Trevor was a great patron of the arts, the bishop, but he also liked the ideas of identity, heritage, and order. He liked his, by employing James Wyatt, actually it was his successor in appointing Wyatt, but in updating the castle, he liked symmetry, he liked order, he liked the idea of divine right, and all these sort of were embodied in these paintings of the 12 tribes of Israel. So we had these extraordinary paintings, which were then displayed in the long dining room. I should probably just caveat right now, I refer to Auckland Castle as a castle and a palace. The reason why is it's actually both, because bishops' residences are always known as bishops' palaces. So the Bishop's Palace at Wells is Bishop's Palace Wells, or whatever, Lambeth Palace is, so we've talked in the past about how palaces are only allowed to be used for royal residences or ecclesiastical, so church residences, or Blenheim Palace, which is the exception, as we've talked about. And lovely Blenheim. And so, yes, it's a bishop's palace, but its name is Auckland Castle, so it's quite a strange one. So I use palace and castle interchangeably.
Sure. That's fine.
If that's just helpful. But yes, so what has happened is these paintings made a very powerful statement when they were hung there, both in terms of sort of this idea of divine right, of power, of order and tolerance. But what he was really doing was he was making a subtle statement advocating for Jewish emancipation, because Richard Trevor was a political liberal. He was a political liberal, and these were the days in the 18th century when Jews and Catholics were heavily oppressed by the Protestant hierarchy, and he was making a statement that the role of the Jews in Christian heritage is very important, and therefore campaigning sort of subtly for Jewish emancipation, as we saw so many people, in that same century campaigning for Catholic emancipation. So it's quite unusual because it's a long way from Spain, the north of England. This cold, frosty medieval castle above these rivers in County Durham is an unusual setting for these very rich, deeply colourful Spanish Baroque, paintings. I mean, really, they're not what you expect when you see Auckland Castle from the outside. These extraordinary.
No. But sorry, just to delve into this a bit more.
Yeah.
Why? I mean, I didn't imagine that the Spanish were remotely keen on Jewish emancipation. So why was he using Spanish Catholic imagery in a Protestant English castle?
That's a good point. I think it was simply that he was a great patron of the arts and wanted the best. We know that he was this this great patron of the arts, and but yeah, it's a good point actually.
It is interesting, isn't it? We don't know how and why. And was it considered? How exactly was it about the prodigal son coming back into the fold, and that's why sort of Jewish emancipation was kind of represented through it? I mean, what was the Jewish connection?
The reason why. So the paintings were already in England, so he didn't buy them from Spain. So they were transported to Spain. So we're talking they were painted in the 1640s. We're now in the 1700s when Bishop Richard Trevor bought them in 1756 or 1757. So over 100 years after they're painted. So they'd been transported from Seville to actually to the Americas, to Spanish colony Americas, and then to England.
Because they got around.
They did get around, and the interesting thing was basically Bishop Trevor bought it particularly because of his public statement for his support of Jewish naturalization. So he was, as I mentioned, a political liberal. He was a keen backer of the Jewish Naturalization Act of 1753.
Sure.
Which basically was one of the acts that really pushed for Jews allowed to become British citizens, basically. I mean, they couldn't.
But I'm curious, how did the paintings themselves represent?
It was his way of making it. It was his public statement of his support, and I think it was done in a way. These were the days when bishops could speak in the House of Lords, and they had political power and influence. But there's that strange thing, of course, which we know. Should ministers of the cloth, men of the cloth, have a say in politics or not? We know that the king is meant to be impartial because he's above politics, but then often people say that vicars and church ministers should also be you should keep their politics out of the pulpit. And so I think I wonder if this was a way of him sort of surreptitiously making a political statement without sort of obviously doing so. It's possible, I'm not sure.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because every now and then you'll read some sort of, well, not scandal exactly, but hoo-ha in the papers about a bishop in the House of Lords making a speech that people don't like. I rather like the fact that we have bishops in the House of Lords. I think it's not just bishops. We have religious leaders in the House of Lords.
You probably like it because the bishops are all liberals, and we know where your politics lies, Rory.
Oh, there we go again. I would have been filling my house. I would have been filling my house with allegorical Spanish Baroque paintings of every kind. Anyway, but okay, so that's fun. I had no idea about that, and that's very, very interesting. But moving on from the paintings, were there any other interesting fittings, fixtures, paintings, furniture?
So there were. What's interesting, and pretty much all the furniture paintings that were collected over the centuries are still in situ in the castle, and we'll talk about why in a minute. But essentially, what we had the Zurbrand collection was the most important collection of arts. There's a fantastic collection of religious texts, great portraits of bishops and monarchs. Bishop Cosin, who I mentioned earlier, was the guy who I think brought in Wyatt. No, that was Shoot Barrington. I lie. Bishop Cosin was the one who rebuilt, who knocked down Hazelrig's mansion. That's right, and rebuilt the medieval castle. And he had a lot of rich woodwork, so sort of in the manner of Grinling Gibbons, sort of Jacobean furniture, and this, and then later we had Georgian furniture added. Enlightenment era artwork. So again, what we see this shift in furniture styles from heavy Jacobean woodwork to much lighter Georgian and Enlightenment era furniture and art. And this, I think, shows almost the spiritual journey of the Church of England from, or people would argue, from quite austere Puritan Protestantism of the English Reformation through to a softer, more ceremonial expression of faith during the Georgian and Victorian eras. So I think we do see through the evolution of the contents of the castle, as well as the architecture, the evolution of the Church of England and its emphasis initially on quite dour sort of Puritanism through to gentler ceremonial stuff, which is interesting.
That is interesting. But there is a sad moment, no doubt, as seems to inevitably happen when it involves the Church of England's nice properties, when it will. I mean, when it must have got sold at some point. So there's a.
Well, yes, this is. Well, you're in fact, the timing for this recording is perfect. Rory and I are recording this on Easter Saturday, which is, of course, the period of waiting. We had Good Friday yesterday when Christ died, and then tomorrow is Easter Sunday, where we recognize the resurrection. And this is quite a symbolic day, actually, for us to be talking about this, Rory, because at this point we had Auckland Castle in great decline. The Church of England was hemorrhaging numbers. This is the early 2000s. We're talking. It was far too costly. They didn't have the same. The bishop. They were no longer Prince Bishops. They didn't have the same income from the land.
So it was still in the Church of England right up until the noughties.
Yeah. So until 2012, but in early 2000s, this is what's interesting. So it was still, and there are still a number of bishops' palaces that are, the Bishop of Wells still has his bishop's palace and various others, but so many have been sold off as the Church of England has been hemorrhaging properties over the years. And what's interesting is in 2001, the Church Commissioners, which is the body that administers the property assets of the Church of England, decided to sell the Zurbrand paintings. This was initially, they thought they would flog the Zurbrand paintings and raise some money. But they never they made this decision, but it wasn't really followed through with until 2011. So at this point, the castle is falling apart. It's a little bit like sort of Maundy Thursday or Good Friday. It's on the edge of death. This castle, it's decrepit, it's decaying. It hasn't been renovated in decades. It's far too big for a bishop with a very small team. It doesn't have an income from the estate. It's really not in a good shape. And in 2011, they decided to push on with selling these Zurbrand paintings. And then what we have is this extraordinary salvation, really. And that comes in the form of this amazing philanthropist and financial investor, collector, investment manager called Jonathan Ruffer. Jonathan is an extraordinary modern-day patron of the arts. He founded a very successful investment management company.
He basically anticipated 2008, didn't he? Which is how he made so much money.
It's interesting, Rory. I've noticed this with people like Jonathan. Jonathan, I believe, read English at Cambridge or possibly history. And I've noticed actually a lot of these very talented investment managers, they read the arts and they're able to read sort of geopolitics in a way that the number crunchers can't. And I think Jonathan is very good at reading people. And I know this, he goes to my church in London, actually. So I've spoken to him a few times, and it's extraordinary. He predicted a lot of things that the markets didn't predict. And I think it's because he doesn't just look at the numbers. He reads the people and the situations. And so he's been very successful in essentially betting on a lot of things that he thought would happen that the markets didn't think would happen. And he made a fortune. And wonderfully, he's a very strong Christian himself, and he believes very strongly in blessing others with his wealth. And so he initially rescued the Zurbrands. So in 2011, he donated £15 million to essentially buy the Zurbrand paintings from the Church of England and place them under a trust, the Auckland Castle Trust. At this point, he also bought the castle itself and the entire collection, not just the paintings, but everything in the castle. So he rescued the entire in situ. He bought of a piece the castle, the estate, the contents, and the Zurbrand paintings. And not only did he make them then available to the public, after centuries of, for centuries, the public couldn't visit these bishops' palaces. It was a private home of the bishop, and only the grandees of the county would ever see these paintings. And so it was the first time, really, that the public could see these extraordinary paintings. Was when Jonathan Ruffer open the house to the public. And not only had he purchased the castle and the entire contents, but he then spent a fortune restoring the entire castle to in the very, the very best way, the most cutting edge lighting and heating, and it really is a sort of resurrection from this freezing cold, decaying castle in 2012 through to the reopening in 2019 with all the latest tech and really fully restored. And not only did they do that, but they also added to the castle. So a 115-foot high tower was erected as a visitor center. And the idea of this tower was that it was a visitor center that you could then get up and have these extraordinary views across the castle and the view beyond. So this was also built. Yeah, I mean, what I love as well is when Jonathan renovated the house, he restored these 14 principal rooms, and they were all recreated from contemporary accounts of the bishops who had lived there. So as much as they could, they were made to look as they were. And then what Jonathan did is he turned really, I mean, I love this. It's not just the resurrection of the house and the castle, it's the resurrection of the entire area. Because what Jonathan then did is he started investing even more in, so for context, Rory, how do we explain, County Durham's not the wealthiest county in England anymore, really. It's in the north of England. It's too far from the major cities, the great industrial revolution cities like Newcastle or Liverpool or Manchester or of course London or Birmingham. It's quite a lot of poverty in County Durham, and Bishop Auckland had this faded grandeur of a once great market town that had fallen into decay.
My understanding was that Bishop Auckland was pretty poor and was struggling.
It was very poor. County Durham is quite a poor county. Bishop Auckland was particularly poor. It didn't have a thriving economy. It was a lot of working class, very, very poor families, and Jonathan knew that it would look incongruous to have this fantastically restored castle juxtaposed with a very poor town and a very poor county. And so what he decided was he thought he would use the castle as a sort of impetus to try and rejuvenate the whole area and the county. And so this is what's extraordinary is he's pumped his money into, he hasn't just, there's that old saying, isn't there, Rory? Teach a man, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. And what Jonathan decided to do is rather than just giving away his cash and, send it, to charities, he decided to invest, because he's an investor, in the rejuvenation of the county and the area. So what he did is he didn't just restore this castle, he opened a museum which provided huge employment. So firstly there was the construction itself of the tower. The museum is the Faith Museum of World Religion, and he built a huge glass greenhouse, and so this gave lots of employment, temporary employment, but then of course it would then give long-term employment to many people in terms of people working at the cafe and restaurant, people working in the museum, in the palace. And then he did some more. So he opened so there are already some former, there's another museum nearby, which is an art gallery, the Mining Art Gallery, which he invested in to help the descendants of miners who were often dependent on the state since the closure of the mines. Yeah. And then he decided to open this amazing thing called Kinwren. So he designed this enormous open-air theatre in the grounds of Auckland Castle. And Kinwren is the biggest outdoor show in Britain. It's 1,000 actors. It's every summer. For the whole summer, it's called An Epic Tale of England. And it's an extraordinary outdoor
1,000 actors.
1,000 actors. It's a 90-minute long performance, and it goes through, in 90 minutes, it goes through key moments in British history over the last 2,000 years, from the Roman over 2,000 years. So you've got the Roman conquest, you've got King Arthur's search for the Holy Grail, you've got Winston Churchill's finest hour speech. And what's amazing is, I don't know if, Rory, you remember in the opening to the Olympic Games in London 2012, that extraordinary way that it started with England's green and pleasant land and then the industrial revolution. It's a little bit like that, but imagine that as a 90-minute long play that shows every day over the whole summer. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Okay. I've got so many questions. That
Yeah.
cannot possibly break even. 1,000 actors all summer. That's extraordinary. I mean,
Well, it has. This is the point. Is what's amazing is who knows if it breaks even at this point. But Jonathan's a very savvy investor. He knows how to make sure it will everything will wash its face in the long term. And it may be that other elements of the estate offset costs or whatever. But it's extraordinary, and again brings not just so much employment, but then it brings seasonal employment for everyone working at the event and the actors. But then of course all the secondary things. All these people who go to Kinwren need to stay in hotels, they need to eat at restaurants, all of that. And so he's really lifted the whole area through.
But I mean, just to play devil's advocate, because I was, ages ago reading, I think, a newspaper article, something had happened at Auckland, and I was reading all these sort of analysis by journalists saying that had the Auckland project worked or not in terms of this sort of miniature example of trickle down economics, and they seem quite cynical. But that was a few years ago, and maybe the whole thing's gathered pace. I mean, is he succeeding in his mission, do you think?
I think he is. I think it takes time, but from what I see, it's only been 10 years since the castle was opened, 6 years since the castle was opened, and little over 10 years since it was rescued. So it'll take a long time for it to get into a rhythm and a routine. But Jonathan takes a very long-term view. He always has.
Yeah, he's also quite old. I mean, what's he going to do when he eventually shuffles off his mortal coil?
Yeah, well, he's got the beauty is everything is run and owned by the Auckland Castle Trust. He has trustees. Right. He's 73. Hopefully, he's got a good amount of time left. His wife Jane is a wonderful lady, a retired doctor who is very, very honoured with running everything as well and overseeing the trustees. Right. And there's lots of little funny overlaps. So at one point, he was considering opening his own hotel in Bishop Auckland for people to stay in when they came to watch Kinwren, and he got Quinn and Terry to drop the plans for that. Quinlan and Francis back in the day. So Francis, who designed our logo, and his father Quinlan designed this hotel, which was never built in the end. But just funny overlaps. It's funny, as I record this episode, I look up at the bookcase above my bureau, and I can see a book that I was given when I worked for Country Life, which was a book by Jonathan Ruffer about game shooting, because funnily enough, as well as being a great city investor and philanthropist, he wrote a lot for The Spectator about his love of field sports. So a man of many talents.
Edwardian country houses or something.
That's right. Yeah.
How interesting. Funnily enough, I actually I can't remember if it was a job interview or an internship or something, but maybe it was an open day. But when I left university, I wasn't sure what I was going to do with my life, and I ended up going to Jonathan Ruffer's firm in London for a sort of initiation day.
Oh, the offices are unbelievable, aren't they? You're going to tell us about them, Rory.
They're very sort of it's a bit weird. You go into this skyscraper type building, and then you
glass elevator and all that, isn't it?
Yeah, and then you walk into this sort of wood panelled rabbit warren that feels
Gainsborough's on the walls. I know,
absolutely extraordinary. You feel like you've walked into sort of the interior of the Titanic. Absolutely bizarre. Amazing, but bizarre.
Oh yeah, it's fantastic. My first experience was exactly that, Rory, at those offices when I was at Country Life, and I went to a press preview of the launch of Kinwren and Auckland Castle, and Jonathan was there, and it was fantastic. But I just wanted to sort of summarize it. In many ways, what we see here is Jonathan was driven by his devout faith to rescue this place and rescue the people who lived in the county. He's given, I think, to date, at least £200 million to the project over the last. So the £15 million he spent saving the castle and the Zerberans is a drop in the ocean compared to what he's invested in the broader Auckland project. And that's almost £250 million he's spent on this town, basically. And it stems from his faith. And I think what's lovely is we see almost as the Church of England declines and as bishops have less power, the Prince Bishop of Durham has less power. We know that the Prince Bishop once had this extraordinary hard power and soft power across County Durham, and it's lovely that we see now people like Jonathan also driven by his faith, but seeking to help people not by just building schools and hospitals like the Prince Bishops did in the past, but by trying to boost tourism and boost the local economy. I think it's this idea of the hope that one's faith gives them. And I think this ties in with our Easter theme, the hope that faith gives people in life beyond the grave, but also a more fulfilling life in this life. And Jonathan has clearly embraced that hope in what he's done for Bishop Auckland.
Well, I think he's certainly a remarkable man, and if any more, very high net worth people had his sort of not necessarily faith, but their commitment to trying to level up, as it were, bits of the UK, because it's I suppose we have the problem that lots of countries have, but everything goes to London, doesn't it? Really, I mean, they've got the big brain drain to London. You've got the city, and all of our wealth really is down there, and other parts of the country don't really get a look at often. And so it takes enlightened individuals like Jonathan Rufford to try and turn things around. So I agree, he's a remarkable man, very impressive, a story of salvation. And I think with that, I should thank you, Jeff, for a very enlightening episode. I didn't know any of this, so I've really enjoyed it. And all that remains is to wish our listeners a very happy Easter.
Absolutely.
Although this will be coming out
joining us today after Easter. Happy Easter week. Thank you, Rory. Great questions, and we look forward to you joining us again next time, lovely listeners. Bye-bye.